Okay, in this final part of the week one lecture in SOCA1010, I'm going to talk about the concept of socialisation. Throughout the three lectures, three parts so far, I've been sketching out what sociology is, sociological imagination, and talking a little bit about things like structure and agency. And socialisation is a way of kind of thinking about that relationship as well, how we come as individuals to be this person that's kind of both produced by various social structures, but also has a place in the world that can influence those various structures and institutions as well. So socialisation also speaks to debates around the ways that humans develop from biology, but also culture. Again, another dichotomy to think about the way that humans are socialised. So on one side, we're born into the world, we have genes and that kind of stuff. On the other, we're kind of born into the world in a certain part of the world, and we're socialised by influence by those around us. And there's a kind of tension between, what has the most influence, what's most important or whatever. Again, the sensible place is about, it's 50-50, and I'll just talk about some examples like that. Sociologists are particularly concerned, though, with notions of biological determinism that kind of see us solely the product of our genes, that we're kind of determined by those things. This is, arguably can lead to all kinds of really detrimental and violent thinking, from the eugenics of the Second World War, notions of survival of the fittest, which is often attributed to Charles Darwin, but was actually Herbert Spencer, who is one of the kind of first sociologists. The notions of genes and stuff like that have become to increasingly dominate the public life and thinking about social problems and particularly health problems. And there's increasing awareness of these kind of genetic issues and how they influence, the kind of opportunities or diseases that you might be open to. But there's public issues involved with this knowledge as well, particularly as that knowledge is often privatised, and this could lead to even more inequalities around kind of health insurance and all that kind of stuff. But more generally, when it comes to kind of health issues or whatever, what sociologists are interested in is talking about how social structures and socialisation plays a key role that influences those kind of things that moves beyond this kind of biological determinism. Importantly, though, it's important not to go to cultural determinism, where we think we're totally the product of socialisation. Again, it's best off thinking through the tensions between those different things. So in terms of genes in particular that have become increasingly popularly understood, they can tell us lots about people's ancestry. They can tell us stuff about possible health outcomes in someone's lives, tending normally to be like a percentage chance of getting something like diabetes or heart disease or whatever. So even there, we need to kind of show very quickly that those genes aren't determinant of someone's life in that sense. So genes do not determine a life outcome, they're a precondition of it. And quite often environmental factors will contribute to whether that outcome actually comes around or not. Very recently, the new kind of science of epigenetics has kind of shown the kind of social relations between cultures and biology, in the sense that it appears increasingly likely that one's genetics can be affected by the environmental conditions and lifestyles of previous generations. Their experience of things like famine or stress or sickness and stuff like that can mark future generations' genes. And so, again, this shows the kind of tight knitting between the cultural and the biological. Twin studies have been particularly useful for kind of showing this relationship. They kind of highlight how, not this kind of blank state influenced by genetics, but we inherit and learn all kinds of things from our kind of social environment. So, for instance, twin studies with about schizophrenia show that, if one twin has it, it's about a 45% chance that the other twin will have it. But, again, see, that's just not necessarily deterministic, because, there's a 55% chance left to kind of other factors. So here's a really good example, I think, of both the genetic inheritance and also the social environment are involved in, the possibility of having this disease. They show that, there's both cultural, social, and also biological kind of nature-nurture things going on in this kind of realm. So a way of thinking about these kind of dichotomies, culture, nature, agency structure and all that kind of stuff, private and public, is through theories of socialization. Essentially, sociological theories of socialization want us to think about how we're born into the world in a certain kind of social environment, and this will have kind of effects on who we become. Like I've spoke about already, you're born in you're not kind of free to completely act outside of those social structures, and really one of the things that make us who we are occurs really early on. And one way of thinking about this is through these kind of levels of socialization. From Talcott Parsons, at least primary and secondary are, the tertiary has been added on by others, influenced by Parsons. Primary socialization occurs during infancy and early childhood under the influence of parents and family members. Essentially, babies are born into a household. They're mostly picked up and kind of fed and played with by mum and dad and maybe sisters and uncle and auntie or grandparents. So these have real effects on the life of the person from that moment on. Key kind of moments of socialization there, particularly, gender. It's where like the toys are played with, where, first exposed to sports and all that kind of stuff that has those kind of gender implications. I've got a picture there of the lady hammer, the pink lady hammer. If you want to see more kind of unnecessarily gendered products that we give to our kids, you can go to that Tumblr link there. So primary socialization is where kind of the initial kind of introduction to the social world happens, but it's relatively restricted to those kind of close, family circle and maybe some kind of friends. But as the child gets older, they move out into the wider world and are then kind of influenced, socialized through these other relations and institutions. Peer groups, friends, stuff like that. Social institutions, so obviously school is a huge socialization influence on people, and the media. Some people may argue that the media should move up into the primary section now as kids kind of consume more and more media at early ages, but we can see this at the moment as kind of secondary socialization. So the exposure to these things are also, influenced by the primary socialization. So mum and dad's opinions about like what to watch on TV or what books to read will have an effect on that child in terms of the mass media that they're exposed to, or the popular culture, or the books they read. And again, this kind of has effects on who they become and the choices they make and the way they see the world. At the tertiary level, this is kind of beyond school. It's really important to kind of think about how socialization doesn't just stop. We're constantly being re-socialized throughout our lives. We're not completely stable beings. But it's true that once we get to kind of our late teens, early adulthood, is when we are kind of the person we become and we have a kind of certain way of seeing the world. This can change, but we are then, by that stage, tend to be fairly socialized with a set of norms and expectations and understandings. But certainly re-socialization can happen in all kinds of different ways, moving to another country, being sent to jail, having a divorce, being made redundant. These things can have, real effects on someone's life and, make them think and see and do things differently. So that's one way of thinking about socialization. Another, and you'll see how these kind of relate to each other, Cooley, Mead and Goffman, who I'm going to talk about in the next couple of slides. Think about, in a similar way, how this stuff happens in stages. Cooley's famous for coining the term the looking glass self, that occurs in 3 stages: how we appear to others, how we observe others to react to us, and then we develop feelings about how those judgments, make us feel, and we kind of then regulate ourselves accordingly. So this is a kind of more interactionist perspective, where we kind of look at others, we copy them, we kind of learn what's normal and what to do. We present ourselves and make choices kind of in that image, and then we observe how they react to us, and this then makes us kind of adjust or develop or change or stay the same, based on that reaction. We use others as a mirror to construct our sense of self, is kind of what that looking glass self metaphor is meant to be illustrating. In a similar way, Mead talks about social interactionism, and you'll hear a lot more about social interactionism in the week on social theory. Mead argues that the self, this kind of concept of person, is constituted in two parts that are in constant dialogue. There's the I and the me. The I is that active kind of person with thoughts and behaviours and emotions and feelings and instincts. The me is the more social self, where the kind of is that kind of thing that's kind of absorbing the reactions of others through those kind of through that kind of mirror thing, I suppose, that Cooley talks about. So the me kind of socializes the I, in that kind of inner dialogue that we have of it with ourselves. Mead argues we are always in dialogue with ourselves in social situations. We go through the trajectory of our day-to-day lives, and we kind of, do the best we can, to conform to certain social expectations. So this is what the kind of basis of symbolic interactionism is about, how people learn behaviours, react to the way that they react to you, and kind of use those expectations to kind of discipline themselves, to live their lives in a certain way. I think Goffman is particularly useful for thinking about this stuff, and particularly learning about socialization. Goffman, very prominent influential sociologist, talks about how we move through life, in a similar sense here from the previous two, but through what he calls impression management. We try to control the way others perceive us, and we do this in what he calls the presentation of the self in everyday life, sometimes referred to as what Goffman called dramaturgical analysis. What Goffman is metaphorically talking about here is that as individuals we're born into the world, through those socialization processes we're kind of handed scripts to kind of, I suppose, learn how to live, learn how to be, a good person, a moral person, all that kind of stuff in different social contexts. So what that means for Goffman is we're kind of given scripts, we learn our lines, and then we play out that role. We learn our lines through expectations, through that impression management, and we perform different versions of ourselves in different contexts of our day-to-day lives. So we're the same person all the time, but we learn what different expectations are in different social settings, and then we adjust ourselves accordingly to fit into those situations. So, you can think about this in your own life. I'm sure that you behave differently in front of your parents as you do maybe in front of your friends. For instance, I pretty much don't really swear in front of my parents, but, probably swear a lot more with my mates. There's all different ways you can think about this stuff. If you're going to a particular event, you'll probably understand there's expectation to dress in a particular way. So you'll learn the lines, you'll follow the script, and you'll play that role. We do this in all kinds of different ways, from the way that you comport yourself in a, say, job interview, and you sit and you manage your body language in certain ways, which is obviously much different than you would if you're out on a dance floor. So again, Goffman's quite useful, I think, for thinking about this kind of ways that we perform versions of ourselves in different social contexts. And that's based on those socialization processes. Our ability to learn our lines well and to play the role well is based on that kind of socialization. Importantly, Goffman talks about a backstage, where you can kind of, inverted commas, be yourself. And, maybe that's kind of singing in the mirror with a hairbrush or something, I don't know. But even in that situation, we're still having that kind of inner dialogue with ourselves. So Goffman, I think that metaphor is quite useful for thinking about how we perform versions of ourselves in everyday life through that impression management. Okay, so I've given you a kind of very brief understanding of socialization there, and I think you'll talk about that stuff a bit more in tutorials. And for the last part of this lecture, I'm just going to make some kind of concluding comments about sociology in general. So, as I kind of pointed out already, sociologists don't speak with one voice. There's a kind of huge range of different sociologies from different theoretical perspectives, using different methodologies, even done from different political orientations. So it's not really left or right, politically. You do find conservative sociologists, but I would say for the most part, sociologists tend to have real concerns around social justice and social inequalities. There's a huge amount of sociological research that addresses most issues you can think of and topics. I'd be interested to see if you could come up with something that there hasn't been a sociological study on. But what's important here to remember is that the important distinction of sociology is it always involves the use of data and evidence to kind of make its claims and to produce its knowledge. So importantly, in tutorials, we'll often ask you to kind of maybe reflect on your life and tell us what you think about certain things that come up in the course. But what we want you to do there is do that through the course material. We're not all that interested in your opinion. What we want you to think about is yourself, your own experiences, and use the course concepts to kind of think critically about that. And hopefully, think differently about some of the things you've gone throughout your life or some of the things you've observed or experienced. Like a lot of social sciences and humanities, over the last couple of decades, there's been some concerns within the discipline of sociology about its relevance. This is particularly the case as, social policy is increasingly just done on the run, made up from promises. Promises are not kept. Funding is kind of allocated and then taken away, and it's really kind of chaotic in that sense. So there's been debates within it about what sociologists need to do to make more of an impact in the world, and this is around the notion of public sociology that comes from particularly Michael Broy. Essentially, there's a kind of debate within sociology about, how much we should remain a kind of science that kind of is doing research on the world and doesn't take into account the way that that's represented in the mainstream media or whatever, and others that argue that, it's really our job to get more involved in that because most of the stuff that happens in the mainstream media is like really misinformed, really biased, often, just completely wrong or whatever. So this is increasingly happening. More and more Australians, sociologists in particular, are participating in the media, particularly on social media, but also in, the press and on TV and stuff like that. There's some links there to some mine and my colleagues' work on the conversation and some other kind of opinion pieces where you can see there's a kind of sociological intervention being made into, particular events of the day or whatever. So again, it's important here to think that sociology is both important in terms of producing knowledge, which is important in and of itself, but we also would hope to have influence on things like policy and things on, the way, and influence on the way people kind of think about the wider world. So to sum up, sociology challenges individualistic and biological accounts of social life and human behaviour, and particularly wants to take into account how societies and cultures and histories and things like that influence our lives, and how this means that there's kind of structural things that ensure things stay the same and, the same people seem to benefit over and over again, but also how these relations engender social change as well. I've already kind of spoke a little bit about kind of, questioning your own stance. So we hope that the sociological imagination that you develop in this course engenders a kind of reflexivity about, yourself, your own life, those around you, but also more generally about the way things are, who benefits from current arrangements and what alternatives exists. It's important to note too that like in a 12 or 13 week course like this, we'll only be covering a fraction of what sociology covers. So there's other intro courses. There's a whole course on intro to religion, sociological religion, and I think there's, criminology and all these other things as well. So just remember that. You'll see the textbook. I think we're only covering, about a third of the textbook. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there as well. So if you're more interested in that material as well, please check that out, and you may be able to develop interest in some of those topics and bring them into your assessment as well. Finally, there's some links here to some of my own work. There's a website where I sometimes post relevant, popular media opinion or analysis or stories that relate to kind of sociological issues and stuff that's going on in the world at the moment. There's an Introduction to Sociology playlist, which is a bunch of videos that I've kind of curated into a list to help understand key sociological concepts and theories. There's also a list there of theorists and sociologists talking about their research. And there's a link there to the Newcastle Youth Studies Network that I'm a part of, that Julia Cook is part of, that's also teaching this course, and some of our other colleagues. So you can check out our research there, and you can do that through our staff profiles as well. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.